This is the penny, officially known as the cent. This coin represents 1/100th of a dollar. In February 2025, President Trump instructed the US Treasury to halt 1 cent production. Why? Well, according to the federal government, it costs nearly 4 cents to produce 1 penny. Plus, it's estimated that there's anywhere from 114 billion pennies in circulation to 420 billion. So it makes sense to halt their production. And technically, we already have enough pennies in circulation, so no problem, right? Right?
And the United States is running out of pennies. Some retailers say President Trump's decision to stop producing the penny earlier this year is starting to affect business.
Earlier this year, President Trump said the U.S. would no longer mint the coin, citing high manufacturing costs. Now there's a shortage at cash registers across the country. Some banks are even rationing them.
Pennies are in short supply after President Trump ordered the Treasury to stop making them.
The company says as a result of President Trump's decision to stop production of pennies, if you pay in cash, you might not get exact change.
The U.S. is running short on pennies after President Trump stopped production earlier this year, and it's having a real impact on banks, restaurants, and grocery stores. Some businesses now saying they're unable to produce that exact change, and banks are even starting to ration pennies for their customers.
So less than 3 months after the Trump administration stopped minting pennies, and even though there's literally billions of pennies that exist, there's a penny shortage. Damn you, Donald Trump! Or maybe there's a better explanation. In September 2024, the New York Times Magazine published a scathing piece titled, "America Must Free Itself from the Tyranny of the Penny." The author, Katie Weaver, writes, "Most pennies produced by the US Mint are given out as change but never spent. This creates an incessant demand for new pennies to replace them. So the cash transactions that necessitate pennies, i.e. any concluding with a sum whose final digit is 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, or 9, can be settled. Because these replacement pennies will themselves not be spent. They will need to be replaced with new pennies that will also not be spent, and so will have to be replaced with new pennies that will not be spent, which will have to be replaced by new pennies that will not be spent, and so will have to be replaced." In other words, we keep minting pennies because American consumers don't use the hundreds of billions of pennies that have already been minted. Which means that one solution to this crisis would be to make people who pay cash use exact change. You know, with the pennies that they most likely have lying around their homes in drawers or in jars. Retailers could also round each cash transaction to the nearest 5 cents. For example, if a cash purchase comes out to $4.96, the retailer could round down to $4.95. If it's $4.99, they could round up to $5. Problem solved, right? Well, not so fast. The Associated Press writes, "The lack of pennies has also become a legal minefield for stores and retailers. In some states and cities, it is illegal to round up a transaction to the nearest nickel or dime because doing so would run afoul of laws that are supposed to place cash customers and debit and credit card customers on an equal playing field when it comes to item costs. So to avoid lawsuits, retailers are rounding down. While 2 or 3 cents might seem like much, that extra change can add up over tens of thousands of transactions." A spokesman for Quick Trip, the Midwest convenience store chain, says it has been rounding down every cash transaction to the nearest nickel. That's expected to cost the company roughly $3 million this year. That means that each of Quick Trip's 850 locations would lose around $3,500 a year. Cheaper than a frivolous lawsuit, I guess. But there is a potential fix. There's a bill currently pending in Congress called the Common Sense Act, which would require cash transactions to be rounded up or down to the nearest 5 cents. The AP writes, "While the proposal is palatable to businesses, rounding up could be costly for consumers." No, it won't. Let's say that a cash transaction is $1.92. That would mean it would be rounded down to the nearest 5 cents, which would be $1.90. If your transaction was $1.93, it would be rounded up to $1.95. The most you would gain or lose would be 2 cents. So saying that rounding up could be costly to consumers is A, massive exaggeration, and B, shows a complete lack of journalistic curiosity of how rounding up or down to the nearest 5 cents would work in the real world. In 2007, Robert Waples, the Wake Forest economist, analyzed tens of thousands of transactions from a convenience store chain to see whether cash register totals would tend to be rounded up more often than down. The last digit's pretty random, Waples said. Averages worked out in customers' favor about as often as they didn't. But also, the gains and losses in question amounted, in the aggregate, to fractions of a penny either way. In other words, a store would round down cash transactions as much as they would round up, which means that both consumers and businesses would break even. It also means that having a law that would force cash transactions to only be rounded down could be tens of millions of times more harmful to major retailers than it would be to any single customer.
You see that people consider them to be a nuisance, and they just don't bring them back into the store. You see them lying on the sidewalk, people don't even pick them up.
Fact check true.
It was time for an experiment. Photojournalist Crisco Beale and I tossed 100 pennies onto this busy Boston sidewalk and waited. And waited. Dozens of people walked by over a 15-minute period, and not one person stopped to pick one up. When you're literally walking over money, that means it doesn't buy you too much.
Waples, along with groups like the National Association of Convenience Stores, also argue that getting rid of the penny will speed up transaction times at store counters and save us money that way.
Fishing into your pocket or your purse to get one when you're doing a cash transaction adds a little time to the transaction, and it slows the line down, and our time is worth money.
So it would make lines move faster, and that's one of the many positives for phasing out the penny. But a lobbyist for Artisan LLC, one of the world's leading coin blank manufacturers, claims that getting rid of the penny would be detrimental.
Mark Weller, director of the pro-penny group Americans for Common Sense, which is funded by a company that produces the metal discs that are used to make coins, argues that getting rid of the penny would cause inflation because businesses would start rounding transactions to the nearest nickel and would more likely try to round up than down.
Nope. That's where the federal law would come in, which would require both rounding up and rounding down.
Businesses have a profit motive, and the fact is it's not going to even out. You can price things in a way that they're going to round up.
Says the lobbyist, who is representing the company that has a profit motive to keep making pennies. But Mark Weller's claims do not live in reality. Katie Weaver points out that while it is theoretically possible that a retailer could see a surplus profit of up to 2 cents on every transaction, the number of variables that need to be precisely manipulated to pull off the feat would require such convoluted mathematical and psychological calculations that it stretches credulity to suppose anyone would bother. In other words, the lobbyist for Big Penny is fear-mongering. I know you're shocked.
Weller says getting rid of the penny disproportionately harms low-income people.
There's billions of transactions that take place under $25, and those are mostly made in cash. And so you're going to have a rounding tax on the people that can least afford it.
But again, this so-called rounding tax would happen during half of cash transactions where you would receive pennies as change. During the other half, a consumer would gain 1 to 2 cents. So the New York Times Magazine asks, who really needs those coins? Mark Weller claims that the poor do, saying that people with relatively low incomes, particularly the young, elderly, and minorities, who use cash more frequently than high-income earners. Also, unbanked Americans who have no other option. Let me guess, Mark. They're also less likely to have driver's licenses and photo ID, right? Sociologists Katie Weaver consulted, whose fieldwork examines the economics of American poverty, challenged this notion. Carrying around bundles of hundreds of pennies to purchase, say, a beverage doesn't seem feasible, said Jacob Faber, a professor at New York University who studies inequality. Sarah Halpern-Meakin, a sociologist at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, told Weaver that the majority of people with low incomes make cashless transactions on apps like Cash App, for instance. Walmart, the nation's largest private employer, pays employees who do not provide banking info with Walmart-branded debit cards. Plasma banks also distribute payments in the form of prepaid debit cards. Wait, poor people have the capacity to use electronic payments? I can't believe it. It's true that cash usage is highest among households with the lowest incomes. Neither expert suggested that it was either obsolete or unpopular. But if significant numbers of Americans rely on penny coins to make purchases, there is no evidence of it. In other words, Mark Weller of Americans for Common Sense is full of it. And now you know what nonsense he's going to spew when he eventually testifies before Congress against the Common Sense Act. So stay tuned. Anyway, that's it for now. If you want to support the channel, head over to my brand new merch store at don'twalkrun.shop. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time, if there is next time.